So excited you spelled my name right. My grandfather, Dick Person, was a very unconventional man. He was also a huge influence on my life. From the time I was 3, he used to tell me that there were only 2 emotions, love and fear. And he rejected modern society because in his mind, it enforced laws that were built on fear rather than on love. In fact, he believed that the only way to truly live fearlessly was to exist outside of society. Excuse me. I remember having a conversation about fear with my grandfather when I was very young. And I think I'd been frightened by a wild animal or something. And he said to me, Cea, fear doesn't live in the wilderness. Fear lives in the city. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, people who close the door when they go to the bathroom. Those are people who are living in fear. Yeah, so needless to say, we did not have an outhouse. So if my grandfather were here right now, he would look around and he would say, I have proof that everyone in this room is living in fear. Why, you ask? Well, it's pretty warm in here, but guess what? We're all wearing clothes. Yeah, guilty, right? So it took me some time to understand that my own definition of fearless was rather different from my grandfather's, but his determination to face fear head on stayed with me throughout my life and saved me more than once. To understand my own definition of fearless, you'll need a little more background. Just before I was born, my grandparents and my very pregnant teenage mother left their home in California and moved to Canada. 1 year later, they packed all of their belongings into 2 canoes and paddled up a river in Alberta into an uncharted wilderness. There, we made our home here, in a canvas teepee sewn by my grandmother on her treadle sewing machine. We lived 7 miles from the nearest road, without plumbing or electricity, hunting and gathering our food. Unlike the rest of my family, it was the only life I had ever known. I learned quickly that to express fear was to admit weakness, and I very much wanted my grandfather's approval. So even when I became lost in the forest at age 5, I kept my wits about me, stayed in one place, and covered myself in moss and leaves to stay warm. After my mother and I left the wilderness, we spent much of our time running from the law. When the cops came to bust us for growing pot, we escaped in her boyfriend's truck. Later, that same truck caught on fire as we were escaping from a stealing spree. Yeah, crazy. But you know, I also learned that being courageous had a downside. When I was 8 years old, I was molested by one of my mother's boyfriends who threatened to throw us out if I didn't go along with it. And I thought it was the right thing to do, to simply and bravely just take the abuse. My closest brush with death came when I fell through the ice of this frozen lake in the wintertime. But no matter what I was going through, I learned to push my fear aside and focus on the challenge at hand, whether it be breaking the ice to move towards shore or trying to convince a couple of very stoned adults that the back of their truck was on fire. So you could say that presence of mind was crucial to my survival. And this would bring me to another of my grandfather's beliefs. He used to tell me that to live anywhere but in the present was to be fearful. The past, he said, was the territory of longing or regret, whereas the future could only inspire an anxiety of the unknown. He even went so far as to tell me that when I was away from he and my grandmother, I should live as if they had never even existed. Of course, I tried and failed, but he did not. Even after I hadn't seen him for 2 years, he didn't ask me a single question about where I had been, what I had done, nothing. It was then that I realized how truly different we were. Of all the things I experienced in my childhood, moving to the city at age 9 was probably the most terrifying. At first, everything scared me: traffic, loud noises, roaming gangs of teenagers, the public bus I took to school. I began to suffer from acute anxiety. What saved me was a dawning understanding that my circumstances actually offered me more power to control my life rather than less. and I really wanted nothing more than to escape my family. My mother smoked pot every day, brought home strange men, and could barely cover the rent on our one-room basement suite. So I decided to do something about my future. When I was 13, I lied about my age and entered a modeling contest. 6 months later, I was on a plane to New York by myself. When I arrived in the city, I realized instinctively that much of being fearless was just acting the part, walking confidently, and keeping my head up. 1 year later, when I was 15, I went to Paris by myself. When I landed, I had barely $1 to my name, no ticket home, and not even a place to stay. I spent my first night sleeping in the hallway outside my agency. But I didn't see what I was doing as being courageous, only as what I needed to do to take the next step to better my life. My modeling career spanned 20 years and offered many opportunities for dangerous situations. And I had a few close calls, but not as many as you might think. Learning how to act fearless in the wilderness had actually enabled me to do the same on the street. I remember thinking at one point that if there was something out there that could scare me, bring it on, because I had yet to meet it. Well, that all changed 8 years ago, when I was 37. 1 month after watching my mother die of cancer at the age of 54, I decided that I could no longer remain in a life that was not working for me. Though my design business had recently failed, I left the relative security of my marriage. This meant that I was leaving with shared custody of my young son, no marketable skills, no job prospects, and no education. I didn't even have a car to drive until a friend lent me one. I pawned my wedding rings to buy groceries. Suddenly, fear was my constant companion. And it was then that I began to think about what had held fear at bay for me in the past. And I realized it had always been focusing on forward movement. So though I wanted to hide away from the world, I dug my way out of my hole by simply placing one foot in front of the other. Now I want to tell you a story about a lonely highway. There are two types of fear, useful fear and useless fear, and this story is about useful fear. When I was 8 years old, my mother and I hitchhiked from Vancouver to the Yukon. The year was 1978. A man picked us up and soon started putting the moves on my mother. When she asked him to stop, he reminded her that there was no one around for miles. As soon as I realized the danger we were in, my bowels literally went liquid with fear. I asked the man to please pull over so I could go to the bathroom. He refused. It was only when my mother told him that I would likely have an accident on his seat that he relented. When he pulled over, we ran. It was only years later that I discovered that we were on the Highway of Tears that day, the same place where 18 women went missing during that time. Perhaps that man would have let us out of his car after toying with us a bit, but perhaps he wouldn't have. The point is, the fear that I felt was so powerful that it manifested a physical reaction in my body, and rather than be overwhelmed by it, I used it to move us away from danger. And then there's useless fear, that little devil that tells you that you've failed, that you can't do it, that you're not good enough. Overcome it by focusing on the things that you can control instead of the things that you can't. I like to think of fear as a call to action. Think about it. If a threat is physical, our instinct leads us to change the situation. So why should emotional threats be any different? Remaining stuck in an undesirable situation is a breeding ground for fear, whereas change and movement, even if in the wrong direction, is fear's worst enemy. Whether you fear leaving a job, a situation, a relationship, a lifestyle, a city, just take a step and your fear will begin to shrink in the face of the power you are reclaiming. Even day-to-day situations offer opportunities to conquer smaller fears. This will serve you well when the really big challenges in life come along. 8 years ago, I decided to write my memoir. It took me 6 years and a huge pile of rejection letters to complete. But you know, let's face it, by then I'd failed so many times in my life that failure no longer frightened me. But that didn't keep all those publishers' doors from staying closed in my face. Here's the thing, it was really when I decided to write my story without fear, letting the world see all of me, all of my story, even the ugly parts, that I found success with it. This is my life today. Though my grandfather's teachings often frustrated me, they also inspired me. He gave me the courage and the strength to reveal my true self to the world, even if I do choose to clothe it. So here's what I want to say to you today. This is what I want you to take from my story. Don't make it your goal to be fearless. Make it your goal to refuse, to be paralyzed by fear. Thank you.